Thank you very much for joining us on Viewpoint, Dr. Hossam Elsharkawi. In a region with so many different overlapping crises, how do you even begin to prioritize your focus, your attention, your resources between so many different groups of people who are suffering from challenges that are very difficult for many of us to understand, and it's all happening simultaneously?
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having us and putting a spotlight on these issues. Humanitarians are needed everywhere. The level of suffering and pain all over the world, but particularly in the Middle East and North Africa region, is off the charts in the last 12 months plus. And even within that, what makes the news is horrific. Often what doesn't even make the news is more horrific, and we call them silent disasters or neglected disasters. We have no option to say no. The toughest thing for us is to not have sufficient resources to mount or launch a humanitarian assistance program that the people truly deserve. And that's just basics. Food and medicine and water and a tent of some sort, or a blanket in winter. And even then we're challenged because those resources are dwindling year after year after year. So however, we do have to set priorities. And that means we have to say no sometimes. And that when we say no, we are fully aware that that village will not get the assistance, but perhaps this village will. And those are the toughest decisions we make in our lives. But we have to make them. And we don't necessarily just focus on what's headlined in the news, because we know it's much broader than that in terms of the level of suffering and need.
Can you perhaps share a little insight on the cases, the stories, the places that are not making the news headlines, those stories that are ignored or neglected?
Sure, there are so many, but I can tell you, I was in Yemen a year ago and I visited many of the distant communities from the Aden and Sana'a sort of focal points, capitals. And I saw that in this day and age, children starving and dying in clinics, mothers desperate to bring just one meal, if any even. Sorry.
It's okay.
Sorry. You'd think this would not happen. And that's not far from here.
Yeah.
And to this day, we don't have the resources.
Yeah. It's organization like yours, so many different countries, so many different communities relying on the work that you do. And it's very interesting that you raise Yemen, the poorest country in the Middle East that has been through a war that not only involved the decimation of civilian infrastructure, but also starvation and famine, and just a situation that now we hardly ever speak about. Though many of those problems and those challenges have never been resolved. They still exist.
Yes, and it should be unacceptable in this day and age, but we let it go and it slides, and it's only when some countries become the scale becomes so unacceptable it makes the news, or politically it becomes of interest to certain countries in the world, then it makes the news. But that's not my world. My world is that any mother of 5 or 7 in Yemen or in Ukraine or in Canada, if in need to be provided with those basics of life. And that's not the world we live in.
And not only are you facing the challenge of meeting the needs of the communities that are relying on the services and the resources that you offer, but also this kind of shocking normalization of attacks and threats against humanitarians and the very people who are trying to deliver life-saving aid to these communities. 32 members of the IFRC network were killed this year, including a volunteer in Gaza this week. Of course, under international humanitarian law, they are entitled to protection in every situation. But I mean, how do you even begin to deal with that situation, trying to secure their safety and well-being?
Yeah, it's very, very tough. It's the worst year of killings of our volunteers and staff and medics across the world. Most of the killings have happened in this region. But it's also been, and I salute to all the journalists, and because it's also been a tough year for our colleagues, the journalists, who've also paid a heavy toll of death and injury this year. And we keep going, and it's tough because I was, and I remain, a trainer for many of our colleagues, up-and-coming generation of Red Crossers and Red Crescent medics and volunteers in various sectors. And we teach them that, listen, this emblem called the Red Cross or this emblem called the Red Crescent is your protection. This emblem painted on the roofs and the flags with ambulances will protect you from being targeted.
Can you give them that reassurance anymore?
No, because, and I've traveled since the Gaza crisis in particular, in and around Gaza. I got into Gaza last February, and I saw the horrific conditions. And where every ambulance team I met said, you know, they did not know if they would live to go home that day. And home was a tent, if any, if they had a tent. Home was makeshift shelter of whatever tin and plastic they could find.
But they carry on.
But they carry on. And they challenged me, and they challenge us still. And we have to be ready for that challenge. You told us we're protected. You told us this emblem and this vest we wear will not make us targets. We are targets sometimes because we are the humanitarians. We're targeted because we wear this vest. And those are tough questions. Those are tough questions for the world and the diplomats and the signatories to the Geneva Convention, because they agreed this 70 years ago plus that this will not happen. But it's happening, and it's happening with impunity.
And that's probably the most worrying part, not just the blatant disregard for international humanitarian law, but the way in which it's become normalized and seems to be accepted and allowed to pass without any kind of justice and accountability. I can see it affects you in a very personal way.
Sadly so, yes. Sadly so. The hypocrisy that has emerged, and it cannot be hidden any longer, is that, yes, there's a dual standard. Some people are worthy of protection and others are not, for the way the world is evolving. And we find that unacceptable. However, we don't do this to make political statements. Our job is and remains to be neutral, to access everyone. We would be treating, and we are, Gazans and Israelis if they need the medical assistance. Those are the standards and those are the values we run the business and our assistance with.
But the misinformation that is disseminated to the world very often is that is not the case, and your work and your very organization has become politicized.
Yeah. So I do, when I sit with governments and ambassadors and diplomats, I say, we will do our job as humanitarians. We will protect all based on principles. You have to do your job as well, because not everything, we cannot be the solution for all of these failed peace processes and unjust agreements and continuation of occupation and so on. You can't just sugar it with money to humanitarians. The solutions are not humanitarian, the solutions are political.
You were just saying that you were in Gaza, but a few months ago, I think you're heading to Syria next. Tell us about your fears for the region over the next 6 to 12 months. You mentioned Yemen. You're also based in Beirut. You've continued to do your work there despite the bombing and the conflict escalating. How are you preparing for a prolonged, unending period of destabilization?
Yeah, it's heartbreaking, really, but it's our job to think scenarios and even think the unthinkable and plan accordingly, and not to be shocked or surprised when it happens. We hope it doesn't happen, but we have to be on the first on the ground responding, supporting also the local responders of Red Crosses and Red Crescents that exist in every country in the world. 190 of them are our members on our network. And the scenarios we are working with, particularly for this region, are grim, protracted, and yes, much pain and suffering will come with that. We have to, I tell our teams this every day, just the best thing we do is that we know we'll make a difference in somebody's life. We will save some lives, we will prevent some suffering, but not for everyone. And that keeps us going.
Well, they are very brave people who've continued with their work in the face of security-related logistical obstacles that many of us would find difficult to understand or to cope with. But nevertheless, thank you very much, Dr. Hossam Elsharkawi, for joining us on Viewpoint. We do appreciate the time.
Thank you.